So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our liability webinar for Safe Routes to School. We appreciate it, and we're glad that we're able to have this opportunity to speak about it. To introduce ourselves, my name is Brian Barnett Woods, and then I'm here with Jim Elliott, and we're both local technical assistance coordinators for the Virginia Safe Routes to School program. And joining us today is Becky Short, and she's a Safe Routes to School Division Coordinator from Prince William County. Becky, do you have anything you want to introduce yourself with?
Sure. My name is Becky Short, and I'm the Safe Routes to School Coordinator for Prince William County Public Schools.
Great, thanks.
How okay, so just to let everybody know, our workaround is that Ryan has Becky on his phone, and she is speaking through the speaker. So let us know in a text if you're having difficulty hearing, and we'll repeat what she says if you are.
Some other webinar logistics issues. If you have any questions, we'll be answering some questions at the end. Please feel free to type in those questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll answer everything at the end. So on your webinar panel, there's a questions tab. Feel free to type that in. So for today's webinar, we're going to talk quickly about what liability is, and we're going to have a disclaimer because it is, liable for us. We're also going to look at some other examples and then present some tips that you can take back to your schools and your school divisions when addressing liability issues. So because it's a legal issue, we do have a disclaimer. This webinar was prepared by Virginia Department of Transportation Safe Routes to School, Jim and myself, and we're here to present a key issue regarding Safe Routes to School liability and some potential strategies to help address the issue. However, this presentation has not been prepared by a lawyer and should not be construed as legal advice. We will not be discussing specific school division policies and liabilities for any specific school division, school, or school-related incident. And we highly recommend that everyone listening and anyone concerned with liability seek the advice of their school division or agency's legal counsel for information specific to your situation. They would have the best idea of what those answers may or may not be.
And keep this in mind when we get to the end of the webinar and you're thinking about your questions. It's possible that Becky has been very kind to join us here and tell us about her experience, but she's not able to tell you about the specifics of liability in your division necessarily. She can only tell you about her experience and sort of what she went through.
So on that note, what exactly is liability? Jim?
So, Brian, liability is a legal responsibility for one's negligent actions or omissions. And liability for negligence, there's a certain standard to establish that, and in general requires that there is evidence that the school had a legal duty of care, and I'll explain that further on the next slide. Evidence that the school breached that duty, and then finally, and this is an important one, that there is evidence that the breach caused the damages or injury for which the suit has been filed.
So Jim, you mentioned duty of care. What is that?
So duty of care is a requirement that a person act toward others with the watchfulness, attention, caution, and prudence that a reasonable person in the circumstances would use. And it really depends on the activities. So if the school controls or directs the activity and that results in the injury, there's a higher duty of care. Also, this depends on the extent to which the school's actions conformed to applicable rules, regulations, policies, or procedures. Of course, if they didn't, then that's an issue. And then finally, the extent to which the school knew or should have known about a particular hazard and failed to correct or warn against it. So those are important things to keep in mind. And I think really the message, one of the key messages of this webinar is that you need to take that duty of care seriously, but also keep in mind that not all injuries result in liability.
Mm-hmm. Jim, can you talk a little bit about when you say degree to which the school controls? What does that mean exactly? What would be a high degree versus a low degree?
Yeah, so simply encouraging walking and biking to school it is a different degree of control. How people get to school is not something the school can prescribe. It's really outside of the school's control. But if the school sponsors a bike-to-school day or a walk-to-school day, a walking school bus, or a bicycle train, if those are school-sponsored, then there's a higher duty of care in those cases.
Right. So why do we need to talk about liability?
So we're talking about this issue because it often comes up in connection with encouraging walking and biking to school. Some are concerned that if they encourage walking and biking to school, or if they sponsor walking and biking events, that will increase their liability. This concern is often based on incomplete information, and that's what we're trying to, that's the sort of the main issue that we're trying to address here. And I think that the main issue that Becky addressed through her experience is getting clarity on the circumstances under which the school or school division would be liable. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we're keeping an eye on Bike to School Day. That's a big event coming up. Now is the time to start thinking about liability in connection with Bike to School Day. It's probably something that is going to be on the minds of principals if you're reaching out to principals. So you'll want to talk to them about it and address any concerns that they may have. And we're hoping that this webinar will help you do that. So I wanted to mention this, or we wanted to mention this Maryland study because I think it's pretty revealing about the lack of clarity that there is on liability issues as they relate to walking and biking to school. So this is a study that's available online, and I would encourage anybody who's really interested in this issue to take a look at it. It was an extensive survey that involved 350 principals across Maryland, and those principals were asked a number of questions, and among those questions was whether or not they encouraged walking and biking to school, discouraged walking and biking to school, prohibited walking and biking to school, or neither encouraged nor discouraged. And you can see on the slide here how everything broke down. So about 19%, 20% encouraged, about 20% discouraged or prohibited walking and biking, and the vast majority neither encouraged nor discouraged walking and biking. So what's interesting about the study is that there was a follow-up question that asked the principals who had indicated whether they discouraged or prohibited walking and biking to school, whether liability concerns influenced their decision, and a whopping 73% indicated that liability concerns did influence their decision. Now, there was another question that asked whether any of those principals had actually consulted an attorney or a risk assessment officer about the details of how they might be liable, and none of them had actually done that. And I think this is a fairly common situation where principals or administrators have an intuitive sense of where or not they might be liable, but they don't really understand the school division's policy because it hasn't been communicated to them. Now, I'll say that I think it would have been interesting in this study if principals who had indicated that they neither encouraged nor discouraged walking and biking had also been asked whether liability was a consideration in their decision not to encourage walking and biking, because I would imagine that liability was an issue for many of those principals as well.
So to introduce our speaker again, Becky Short from Prince William County. And you can see Prince William County is in the northeast of the state. And she's going to talk to us about kind of what she came across when she learned about liability within her school division. Becky, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, great. So the first question that we wanted to ask was simply, how did you get involved with this liability issue?
Well, when I first encountered it was just simply scheduling meetings with principals to tell them about the opportunities with safe routes to school and everything that we do and what I was planning for the school year, and started talking about walking and biking and asking the principals whether they encourage the kids currently to walk and bike, and it was just kind of they weren't really sure if they wanted to say they did or didn't, and I really wasn't too sure why at first. And then several of them stated, well, I know we're liable for these kids, so we're not in the best neighborhood, or there's high-speed traffic, all different reasons, and they would say that they didn't encourage biking or walking or both because they were liable, and heard of different policies and rules and things that made them think they were liable for these kids.
Becky, were any of those policies, like between principals, were they all talking about the same policies, or was it just kind of a general sense of, well, there are, of course, liability policies?
The policies, they were kind of all referred to the same thing, was a door-to-door policy.
What? Could you talk about what that is?
Yeah, actually, well, the first thing is there has never been a door-to-door policy. Just to set that straight, there had never been. I met with the county's attorney, and he researched and looked back just as far as he could go, and never saw any indication or record of any such policy ever. It was basically just kind of passed along for so long that everybody thought that was the rule, that it was true, and that the door-to-door policy meant that these principals were responsible for these kids from the moment they left their homes and walked out their front door until they got on school property, that they were liable for those kids in between that entire time. And
right.
So I met with the county attorney, and he said, absolutely not true. This is for Prince William County, though.
So that kind of goes into the next question. So once you discovered it was an issue, you spoke with your attorney. Did you do any research on your own, or did you just go right to him?
I just went straight to him.
Okay.
There wasn't a whole much of a way for me to find out, and I wanted to make sure that even if I did start researching on my own, that what I came across and what I found was absolutely true before I relayed anything back
That's a great
to the
point.
principals and schools.
All right, great. And then, without, I guess, going into specifics, I mean, did you ask the attorney about specific or liability in terms of bicycles, liability in walking, or was it just kind of an overall policy?
It was overall. Whether they're biking or walking, it didn't matter. Just them getting from their home to the school on school property.
All right. So I guess after you learned about Prince William County's liability policies, what did you do with that information?
I used that information. I got it back to the principals I had already met with that had major concerns about liability, thinking that they didn't want to promote walking or biking because they were liable, and used that as kind of their main reason for not wanting to get involved in anything. And I just got the information back to them and told them I have great news, and told them about the policy and that I had met with the county's attorney and that I gave them his information if they had further questions that I couldn't answer, and told them that there is no door-to-door policy and you are not liable for these kids commuting to and from school, whether they're walking, riding their bike, until they're on school grounds. And even that is, defined more. So some of them were surprised, I guess I could say, just thinking, I guess, for so long that they were liable for these kids, actually liable for these kids. It's hard to just say, oh, well, I'm not liable anymore. So I'm sure it's going to take a little while for them to really understand that, I'm sure all of them are still going to remain, concerned about the kids, to and from school and feel liable, but when it comes down to it, not actually being liable, they may be more inclined to promote more of the activities with safe routes to school.
That's a good point to bring up. And then I guess looking ahead into the future, do you have any plans for reminding principals and school administrators about liability, or do you have any plans of just, reminding them every once in a while, or I guess will you continue to kind of follow up with this, or what will you do?
I think the main thing is, I have a lot of schools. I've got like 80 schools, so I have by no means met with every principal. So as I continue to meet with more principals, I will definitely take that information and present it to them, up front, upon the first meeting, so that it's cleared up right then and there. I have the facts, they get it all right there. They don't have to wait for me to get back to them with the information. I've got it. It's it makes me look better because I know the answers. I can tell them this is the way it is. If they'd rather hear it from the attorney, that he has no problem, answering anybody's questions. And I also plan on, as I send emails or as my boss sends emails to principals about certain big events like Walk to School Day, Bike to School Day, that he would add in there something about liability. If you have concerns or questions about liability, please feel free to, give me a call. And we still haven't quite figured out if we're going to write on there, well, you're not liable. Not quite sure it's going to be that way, but if you have questions or concerns about it, to give us a call. That everybody in Prince William County is more than capable of promoting biking and walking to school and feeling, when it's safe to do so, and feel comfortable with it.
That's some good advice.
Thank you very much, Becky, for sharing your experience with that.
Yeah. And then,
absolutely, thank you.
Oh, thank you. And then just for the audience, if you have questions for us or for Becky, please type them in, and Becky will be here at the end as well to answer questions. Moving ahead, we just wanted to talk about a few more additional tips that safe routes to school advocates in schools and things should consider when they're thinking about liability and their safe routes to school policies.
Right. So number one is just be aware of what your local laws, regulations, and school policies are. Remember, that was included as part of the duty of care criteria. So you should make sure that you know what those policies are. You do what Becky has done and connect with the attorney for your division or the risk manager for your division and find out what the policies really are. So secondly, providing safety education to students and safety information to parents.
So, Jim, when you say safety education and information, what exactly do you mean?
So safety education can be a lot of different things. For Bike to School Day, if you're preparing for Bike to School Day, safety education is very important. You can do a variety of things. You can schedule a bicycle rodeo, for example, which teaches bicycle skills, bicycle safety tips, helmet fitting, things like that. There are also bicycle and pedestrian safety curricula out there that you can use. One that is well known and that we recommend is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's Child Pedestrian Safety Curriculum. But there are other curricula out there that could be used at a school to teach students safety. Now, as far as informing parents, there are a couple of different levels of that. One is just recognizing that parents are very important when it comes to developing safety skills in children. So it's important to communicate what skills children should be developing to parents, and to suggest that they practice those skills with their children. That's very important. Another thing that's important is to make parents aware of pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure around the school, crossing guards, signals, things like that, that may be important factors in the route that their child takes to school, so that they make an informed choice about what route they choose for their child.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And then you will also want to keep in mind that if you're going to have crossing guards or any school staff that are engaged in traffic safety, be sure that they're properly trained. I know AAA does a program where they do crossing guard training, but there are other programs as well, and just make sure that your school staff, if they're going to be supporting traffic safety programs, make sure that they're properly trained so that they know the best ways to go about it.
Okay, and a big part of this, especially if a school is sponsoring an activity, and that means something like Bike to School Day, which the school has put on the calendar and is endorsing, a bicycle train that is sponsored by the school. Now there may be bicycle trains and walking school buses that aren't sponsored by the school, and the duty of care is less. But in cases where the school is sponsoring an event, there are a number of other steps that the school should be taking. One is to try to develop a plan that identifies potential safety concerns around the school. We call this a Safe Routes to School plan, and we highly recommend it. And it should be something that looks at safety in a comprehensive manner. So it doesn't just look at infrastructure issues, things like sidewalks and bike lanes, but also looks at behaviors and develops strategies for addressing any known safety issues that come up in the development of that plan.
Yeah, it's a great way to organize your strategies by enforcement, evaluation, education, and engineering.
Yeah, those are the 5 E's, and they're very important in Safe Routes to School because we recognize that transportation issues are complex, that it's not just a matter of fixing the infrastructure, that you have to look at everything together. So then the other thing is, once you've developed your plan and you've identified some safety issues, you need to document what you've done to try to address those issues.
And here's another thing that Virginia Safe Routes to School offers. We do walkabouts for specific schools, and we can have the walkabout where a team of stakeholders comes together, and you can take a walkabout around the school and look at specific areas that could be recommended for engineering improvements in the future, but as well as just places where we should think about, oh, this is where we should focus some of our efforts.
Right, and then waivers. Waivers are a good way to inform parents about what's going on and who's responsible, making them aware that they're responsible and that there may be risks associated with what is happening. It's also a way to communicate pedestrian and bicycle safety information, because if a parent has to sign a waiver, then if you include relevant safety information along with that waiver, parents are much more likely to read it. So it's a good way of communicating with parents as well.
Yeah, and waivers and permission slips are a really great way just to reach out to parents and get them involved with your Safe Routes to School program. And then finally, something that we want to look at is obtaining adequate insurance to cover your program. Most schools have an umbrella insurance program, but just make sure that before you're going ahead with these activities and events, you follow up with your school division's legal counsel or their risk assessment manager, and then find out what exactly is the school's insurance policy. So thinking more about liability, we realize that it's important, and it's an important consideration for Safe Routes to School.
Right.
We know it's kind of a sensitive issue, but well so, because it involves children's safety, and that's something that's important not only to schools but parents as well. Right, and it can be a barrier to establishing Safe Routes to School programs and encouraging walking and biking. And oftentimes, it's a barrier based on, incomplete information. Mm-hmm. Decision makers assume knowledge about liability, but they haven't actually spoken to an attorney or a risk assessment officer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that, make sure that take that step as an advocate for Safe Routes to School, find out what the school division's policy is, and then share that information so that everyone's on the same page. Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that this may not always be an expressed concern. That is, you may not have administrators telling you, yes, I'm concerned about liability, but it may be in the back of their mind. So it makes a lot of sense to bring it up and to try to address it, even if it's not expressed. Mm-hmm. And as we learned earlier from Becky Short's experience, and what we've been talking about this whole time, the best approach is really to seek out your school division's legal counsel or risk management officer to really clarify what the issues are. Right, and then once you've clarified the division's liability policy, you'll likely need to follow up with administrators to remind them about it every time there is a new biking or walking event. Mm-hmm. Because for some administrators, it's going to run contrary to their intuitive sense of things, and they may forget. Mm-hmm. So reminders are typically in order. There are a few more resources we want to talk about. So in addition to this webinar, on the National Center website, which is saferoutesinfo.org, if you search for liability, you can see their introduction to liability. And this is a great webinar that just talks about an overview of what liability is and then how it affects Safe Routes to School programs. And the tip sheet's excellent as well. A lot of the material that we pulled for this webinar came from the tip sheet or from that webinar as well. Mm-hmm. And then the Safe Routes to School National Partnership also has a great webinar called Liability 201 that builds off the National Center's webinar. And this takes a look at some specific examples of how the school is liable when it comes to crossing guards, or how the school is liable when it comes to setting up a bike train or using remote drop-offs. So you can see that webinar at saferoutepartnership.com. So before we begin with questions, we just want to remind everybody about our disclaimer. We are not attorneys, so do not construe our responses as legal advice. Yes. And we highly recommend, again, to speak with your division's legal counsel. Right, right. And so if you have questions, please type them in and indicating who you have a question for, whether it's all of us in general or if it's a question that you have specifically for Becky, indicate that in your question text. And keep in mind that Becky
can relate certain things about her experience, but not others. That the specifics of liability in Prince William County are not going to be the same as the specifics in your division, and that's why she can't really talk about all the specifics.
So the first question that we have, it reads, liability aside, what about safety concerns? No school wants a child to be harmed because of a program they've approved. And we absolutely agree. No school does want a child to be harmed because of this program. And I think the idea of liability is to make sure that you're aware of what those safety concerns are. So one of the steps we talked about earlier of sharing safety information with parents and safety education with students is the best way to approach this. Be sure that parents are aware of which intersections have crossing guards, which intersections have signalized crossings, which intersections have which streets have high and low volumes of traffic. The best way to really address safety is to make sure that everyone has the best information.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to recognize that every school activity has an element of risk, and that schools have insurance to cover that. You should be doing all you can to address any safety concerns that there are. You should be exercising your duty of care, in other words. But there's no way that every danger can be addressed.
I also have something to say on that. Also implementing safety training for the school, for the community, for the parents, the students, would also help put the parents and the school's minds at ease, knowing that they've gone through some sort of safety training, pedestrian safety or bicycle safety training.
Yeah, and it might also, along the same lines, personal security training might be relevant in some communities too, to help address any personal security-related issues. Bicycle trains and walking school buses are another way to kind of address concerns about personal security. So keep those in mind as strategies.
Let's see, the next question we have, do we know about any cases where a school has been sued because of liability? Jim?
And so we didn't do any research on this prior to the webinar. We did listen to other webinars in this topic. And in the partnerships webinar, which I think came out in January, they say that actually no school has ever been sued as a result of a Safe Route to School sponsored event. So, it doesn't sound like this has happened before, but it doesn't mean that it's not a concern. It doesn't mean that schools and school divisions don't have a duty of care that we described. So just be mindful of that.
We have a suggestion from one of the listeners. Vermont Safe Routes to School has a great crossing guard training video, which is available online at saferoutesdt.org. So if you're thinking about having crossing guards or teaching school staff to act as crossing guards, take a view at this video to see what they're doing in Vermont. The next question, assuming there is no door-to-door policy, where physically does liability begin and end? So this question might be something that we can't answer because it will depend based on the policy for each school division.
Yeah, I think so, but I mean, thinking about it, what Becky found and what she said earlier was that there is no such issue, and that once children are on school property, or I think it's also if children are off school property and it's a school-sponsored activity, then there is increased liability on the part of the school or the school division. In the case of simply walking and biking to school, this is how people get to school. People also drive to school. They take the bus. And school districts are not any more or less liable for injuries that occur as people are driving to school than they are if they walk or they bike to school. This is something that is generally outside of a school's liability purview or risk.
Becky, without going into too much detail, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I agree with that. The liability is going to depend on the school where it, like they asked, where it starts and ends. Yeah, but I agree with you on that.
All right, great. Well, if there are any other last questions, please type them in now. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so.
Right, and just to repeat, despite what we've said, and we've suggested some general principles related to liability, the overriding message of this webinar is really that you need to talk to the experts in your division to understand this issue, and it's an important issue to understand.
And then if you have any other general questions about Virginia Safe Routes to School, please feel free to call us on the Virginia Safe Routes to School toll-free hotline or to email a local technical assistance coordinator. Thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you.